They say every detective has that one case that changes them forever. The case that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling while your mind replays evidence over and over, searching for the piece you missed. For me, that case began on a rainy Tuesday morning when an elderly pawnshop owner called about a Bible that shouldn't have existed. My name is Detective Marcus Reed, and in 15 years of police work in Portland, Oregon, I've seen enough human tragedy to fill several lifetimes. I've worked domestic violence cases that would turn your stomach, drug deals gone wrong that shattered entire families, and murders that made no sense no matter how many times you studied the evidence. I thought I'd become immune to surprise, hardened by the endless parade of human weakness and cruelty that crosses a detective's desk. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 12 years after a young nun named Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly vanished from St. Bartholomew's Convent without a trace. No signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no body, no leads. Just an empty room and a community of faith left wondering what happened to one of their own. The case had gone cold so long ago that most people had forgotten her name. But here's the thing about cold cases. They're never really dead. They're just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up and demand your attention again. And when they do wake up, they usually bring secrets with them. Secrets that make you question everything you thought you knew about truth, justice, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. This story begins with a Bible in a pawn shop, but it ends in places I never could have imagined when I first heard Eleanor Henderson's nervous voice on the other end of my phone that November morning. It's a story about identity and faith, about the difference between disappearing and hiding, and about how sometimes the people we're desperately searching for are living lives too complicated for simple explanations. If you think you know how missing person cases work, if you believe that every mystery has a clear-cut solution with obvious victims and perpetrators, then what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you understand about human nature. Because sometimes the truth isn't about solving a crime. It's about understanding why good people make impossible choices when love and faith collide in ways that break your heart. This is the story of Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly, and it starts with a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about what it means to be lost. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I need to ask you for a huge favor. If you're as fascinated by real mysteries and human stories as I am, please hit that subscribe button right now. It literally takes 1 second and helps me bring you more cases like this one. And if this introduction has already caught your attention, smash that like button to let me know you want to hear the rest of Sister Mary Catherine's story. I promise you, the twists and revelations ahead will blow your mind in ways you never expected. Most importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think happened to Sister Mary Catherine? Do you believe someone can truly disappear in today's world? Have you ever known someone who seemed to be living a double life? Your thoughts and theories make these videos so much better, and I read every single comment. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. This case will challenge everything you think you know about missing persons, faith, and the incredible lengths people go to protect those they love. So buckle up, because we're about to uncover a truth that's been hidden for 12 long years. My name is Detective Marcus Reed, and I've been working cases in Portland, Oregon for 15 years. In that time, I've seen domestic violence that would make your stomach turn, drug deals gone wrong that left families shattered, and enough human tragedy to fill several lifetimes. I thought I'd seen everything until that great Tuesday morning when Mrs. Henderson from 5th Street Pawn called about something that would change everything I thought I knew about cold cases. The November rain hammered against my office window with the kind of persistence that makes Portland natives joke about webbed feet and perpetual dampness. It was 8:47 a.m. when my phone rang. cutting through the quiet buzz of the precinct's morning routine. Coffee was still steaming from my desk mug. Black, no sugar, the way I'd been drinking it since my rookie days when there wasn't time for cream or pleasantries. Detective Reed? This is Eleanor Henderson down at 5th Street Pawn. Her voice carried that particular combination of authority and nervousness that comes from running a business in a tough neighborhood for decades. I think I have something you need to see. Something that might be connected to, well, to police business. I knew Mrs. Henderson by reputation. A straight shooter who'd called us exactly 3 times in 23 years of operating her shop, and each time it had been legitimate. When Eleanor Henderson said she had something for the police, you listened. What kind of something, Mrs. Henderson? It's a Bible, Detective, but not just any Bible. There's an inscription inside that mentions a nun, and I keep thinking I've heard that name before. In connection with something bad that happened years ago. 20 minutes later, I was driving through the familiar streets of southeast Portland, my windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the Oregon rain. The neighborhoods here told stories. Renovated craftsman houses where young families were trying to build better lives, mixed with older buildings that carried the weight of harder times. Gentrification was creeping eastward from the river, bringing artisanal coffee shops and boutique yoga studios, but it hadn't reached this particular corner yet. 5th Street Pawn sat wedged between Faux Saigon, where I'd eaten lunch more times than I could count, and Martinez Tire Repair, its neon sign flickering weakly in the morning gloom. The Cash for Gold sign in the window was sun-faded but still readable, and through the security grating, I could see Mrs. Henderson moving around behind the counter like she was preparing for something important. Eleanor Henderson was exactly as I'd imagined her, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades but was still perfectly serviceable. Her eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of eyes that had seen every sob story, every desperate lie, every genuine tragedy that walked through her door looking to trade memories for cash. "Detective Reed, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice carrying that nervous tremor people get when they realize they're about to become part of someone else's story. "I've been running this shop for 23 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. I mean, I've had people bring in all sorts of things. Wedding rings from bitter divorces, musical instruments that kids abandoned, jewelry that belonged to grandmothers who died alone. But this feels different." She led me past display cases filled with the usual pawn shop inventory. Guitars with missing strings, power tools that had seen better days, jewelry that sparkled hopefully under fluorescent lights. The smell of old wood and metal polish hung in the air, mixed with something else, the faint scent of the vanilla candles Mrs. Henderson burned to make the place feel more welcoming. "It's back here," she said, leading me to the counter where she conducted business. I set it aside as soon as I saw the inscription. Something about it just didn't feel right for regular inventory. The Bible sat under the harsh fluorescent lights like a piece of evidence waiting to be discovered. It was leather-bound, the kind of quality that spoke of significance rather than casual ownership. The cover was worn, edges softened by countless touches, and the leather had developed that particular patina that comes from years of handling by someone who truly treasured it. This wasn't a Bible that sat on a shelf gathering dust. This was a Bible that had been read, carried, loved. I pulled on latex gloves before touching it, a habit so ingrained that I barely thought about it anymore. The binding creaked slightly as I opened it, the pages revealing that familiar thin paper of serious religious texts. But what caught my attention wasn't the biblical text itself. It was the inscription on the inside cover, written in careful script with black ink that had faded slightly but remained perfectly legible. Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly entered into service September the 15th, 2010. The name hit me like a physical blow. I felt that familiar chill that runs down your spine when a cold case suddenly gets hot, when something you'd filed away in your memory as unsolved suddenly demands attention again. Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly. I'd inherited that file when I transferred to this precinct 5 years ago, and I'd read it thoroughly enough to remember the basic details. 24 years old when she vanished from St. Bartholomew's Convent after evening prayers on March 18, 2012. No witnesses, no evidence, no leads that went anywhere meaningful. The kind of case that haunts detectives long after the files get buried under newer tragedies. The kind that makes you wonder if you missed something obvious, if there was some thread you didn't pull hard enough. "Who brought this in?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. The small spiral-bound kind that fit easily in a jacket pocket and had been my constant companion for 15 years. Mrs. Henderson's fingers drummed nervously on the counter, a rhythm that spoke of anxiety barely held in check. Young man, maybe early 30s, tall, thin, dark hair that needed cutting. He came in yesterday afternoon, around 3 o'clock. Said he found it cleaning out his grandmother's house after she passed last month. She paused, studying my face with those sharp eyes. Seemed honest enough at the time, but now I'm wondering if I should have asked more questions. This is connected to something bad, isn't it? I nodded, already thinking about the phone calls I'd need to make, the files I'd need to pull, the investigation that was about to consume the next several weeks of my life. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to need you to write down everything you remember about this man. Physical description, approximate time he came in, anything he said about his grandmother or how he found the Bible. Did he give you a name, address, any documentation?" "He said his name was David Martinez, gave me a phone number and address for my records. Cash transaction, $35. I've got his information in my logbook." She moved toward a worn ledger book with the efficiency of someone who'd been keeping meticulous records for decades. "Detective, can I ask what happened to this nun? I mean, I remember hearing something on the news years ago, but I can't recall the details." As she bustled away to gather the information, I stared at the Bible, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. 12 years. Sister Mary Catherine would be 36 now if she was still alive. The question that had puzzled investigators for over a decade suddenly had new urgency. What happened to the young nun who simply vanished into the Oregon night? I flipped through the pages carefully, looking for anything else that might provide clues. The margins contained handwritten notes in the same careful script as the inscription. Bible verses underlined, passages marked with small crosses. The marginalia of someone who studied scripture seriously. Some pages showed more wear than others, as if certain passages had been read repeatedly, returned to in times of need or contemplation. One page in particular caught my attention, Psalm 139. With the verses 13 to 16 heavily underlined and a small notation in the margin that read, March 15, 2012. 3 days before her disappearance. The verses spoke of God's intimate knowledge of each person, of being known completely and loved unconditionally. Whatever Sister Mary Catherine had been going through in her final days at the convent, these verses had clearly spoken to her situation. Mrs. Henderson returned with a manila folder containing copies of David Martinez's identification and contact information, along with her handwritten notes about the transaction. "Detective, there's something else. Something I didn't think about until just now." I looked up from the Bible, giving her my full attention. When he brought the Bible in, I asked him if he was sure he wanted to sell it. I mean, it's clearly a religious item, something that belonged to a nun. Seemed like the kind of thing a family might want to keep, you know. But he got this look on his face, like he was carrying some kind of weight, some burden he needed to set down. She paused, adjusting her glasses as she recalled the interaction. He said something that stuck with me. She's not coming back for it, and keeping it is just making things harder. I thought he meant his grandmother at the time, but now I'm wondering if he was talking about someone else entirely. The implications of that statement sent a chill through me. If David Martinez knew something about Sister Mary Catherine's fate, if this Bible represented evidence rather than just a family heirloom, then this case was about to become much more complicated than a simple missing person inquiry. I carefully closed the Bible and slipped it into an evidence bag, though I suspected it would need to go to the lab for fingerprinting and any other trace evidence it might contain. Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to need your security footage from yesterday afternoon, and I'll need you to write down exactly what Mr. Martinez said during your transaction. Every word you can remember. As I prepared to leave the pawn shop, Bible secured in my evidence kit and Mrs. Henderson's information tucked safely in my case folder, I felt the familiar weight of a new investigation settling on my shoulders. Somewhere in Portland, a man named David Martinez had answers to questions that had been haunting investigators for 12 years. And somewhere in the city's maze of neighborhoods and secrets, the truth about Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly was finally ready to surface. The rain continued to fall as I drove back to the precinct, but I barely noticed it. My mind was already working through the next steps, running Martinez's information through our databases, pulling the original case file, contacting St. Bartholomew's Convent to see if anything had changed in their understanding of the case. After 12 years of silence, Sister Mary Catherine's story was about to continue, and I intended to follow it wherever it led. The drive to St. Bartholomew's Convent took me east through Portland's sprawling suburbs, past strip malls and coffee shops that had sprung up like mushrooms since my last visit 12 years ago. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a weak November sun that struggled through the clouds. As I turned onto the winding road that led to the convent grounds, the urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and the distant outline of the Cascade Mountains. St. Bartholomew's hadn't changed much in the intervening years. The complex of red brick buildings still stood like silent sentinels against the backdrop of Mount Hood's snow-capped peak, their Gothic Revival architecture speaking of permanence and contemplation. The main chapel's bell tower rose above the other structures, its bronze bell visible through the arched openings where it had called the faithful to prayer for over 80 years. I parked in the same gravel lot where I'd left my patrol car in March 2012, when I was Detective Second Grade Reed, newly transferred from the domestic violence unit and still learning the rhythms of missing person investigations. The memory was vivid, driving out here on a cold spring morning, uncertain what I'd find, hoping for a simple explanation that never materialized. The main entrance doors were heavy oak, their dark wood polished to a warm glow that spoke of decades of care. Brass handles, worn smooth by countless hands, pulled open to reveal a foyer that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with portraits of previous Mother Superiors, their painted eyes seeming to follow visitors with benevolent authority. The scent that hit me immediately was exactly as I remembered. A mixture of old wood, burning candles, lemon oil, furniture polish, and something else that was purely institutional. The smell of communal living, of shared meals and shared prayers. A young nun I didn't recognize, probably in her 20s, with the kind of peaceful expression that comes from genuine contentment, greeted me at the reception desk. "Detective Reed?" Mother Superior Agnes is expecting you. She asked me to bring you to the parlor right away." As we walked through corridors lined with religious artwork and windows that looked out onto carefully maintained gardens, I found myself remembering the layout of the building. The way sounds echoed off the high ceilings. The sense of stepping into a world that operated by different rules than the one I inhabited daily. The parlor was exactly as I remembered it. A comfortable room with heavy wooden furniture, religious paintings on the walls, and tall windows that provided natural light without compromising the sense of sanctuary. Mother Superior Agnes rose from her chair as I entered, and I was struck by how much she'd aged in the 12 years since our last conversation. When I'd first met her, Mother Superior Agnes had been a woman in her early 60s, her face lined but strong, her posture erect with the confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. Now, approaching 75, she moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, her hair completely silver beneath her habit, her hands showing the spotted transparency that comes with decades of service. But her eyes, those sharp, intelligent brown eyes, held the same steady strength I remembered, the same sense of someone who had seen much, understood more, and found peace with the complexities of human nature. "Detective Reed," she said, her voice carrying the same soft authority that had impressed me years ago. "I heard about the Bible discovery. Sister Joan called me yesterday after she saw the news report." She gestured toward the chair I'd occupied during our previous interviews, and I was struck by how the furniture placement hadn't changed at all, as if this room existed outside the normal flow of time. I settled into the familiar wingback chair, its dark leather worn smooth by countless conversations, and opened my case file. The manila folder contained not just my current notes, but copies of the original investigation reports, photographs of Sister Mary Catherine's room as it had been found, and witness statements from the other nuns who had been present during her final days at the convent. "Mother Superior, I need to go through everything again," I began, pulling out my notebook. Sometimes when new evidence surfaces like this Bible, it can shed different light on old information. Details that seemed insignificant 12 years ago might suddenly become crucial. She nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap, in a gesture that conveyed both patience and underlying tension. "I've been praying about this conversation since Sister Joan told me you were coming. In 12 years, Detective Reed, not a single day has passed that I haven't thought about Sister Mary Catherine. Not one day that I haven't wondered if there was something more I could have done, some sign I should have recognized." I studied her face, seeing the weight of pastoral responsibility that she'd been carrying for over a decade. "Tell me about her again. Not just the facts from the original report, but your impressions, your concerns, the things that might not have made it into official statements." "Mother Superior." Agnes leaned back in her chair, her eyes growing distant as she called up memories that had clearly been revisited countless times. "Sister Mary Catherine was one of our youngest novices when she came to us in September 2010. 22 years old, recently graduated from Portland State with a degree in social work. She'd expressed interest in religious life during her senior year of college, had been volunteering at various Catholic charities throughout the city." She paused, reaching for a glass of water that sat on the small table beside her chair. "But even from the beginning, I sensed that she was carrying burdens unusual for someone her age. Most young women who enter religious life are seeking something: a deeper relationship with God, a way to serve others, a sense of purpose. Sister Mary Catherine seemed to be running from something as much as running toward something. This matched the psychological profile we developed during the original investigation, but I wanted to hear it in Mother Superior's own words. What made you think she was running from something? The way she talked about her past life, or rather, the way she didn't talk about it. Most novices are eager to share their stories, to explain what brought them to religious life. Sister Mary Catherine was different. When asked about her family, her childhood, her experiences before entering the convent, she would give very brief, factual answers and then change the subject. Mother Superior rose and walked to one of the tall windows that looked out onto the convent's main courtyard. From where I sat, I could see her silhouette against the afternoon light, her profile showing the mixture of strength and sorrow that seemed to define her approach to discussing Sister Mary Catherine. She'd grown up in a difficult home situation, she continued, her voice growing softer. Her father abandoned the family when she was 12 years old, just disappeared one day, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. Her mother battled addiction, alcohol primarily, but also prescription medications. Sister Mary Catherine, being the eldest, essentially became the parent to her 2 younger siblings while still in middle school. I made detailed notes, remembering how this family history had been a significant part of our original investigation. We'd interviewed the mother, Patricia Donnelly, multiple times, but her addiction issues and general instability had made her an unreliable witness. The siblings had been too young at the time of Sister Mary Catherine's disappearance to provide useful information. The convent became her sanctuary, Mother Superior continued, turning back toward me. But I always wondered if it was a healthy sanctuary, a place to grow and serve, or an unhealthy one, a place to hide from life's complexities. There's a difference, Detective Reed, between choosing religious life out of love for God and choosing it out of fear of the world. This insight struck me as particularly significant. Did you ever discuss this concern with her directly? I tried to several times during her formation period. But Sister Mary Catherine was guarded, I suppose is the best word. She would acknowledge that her childhood had been difficult, but she insisted that those experiences had strengthened her faith and her calling to religious life. She was intelligent, articulate, and could present very convincing arguments for why the convent was exactly where she belonged. Mother Superior returned to her chair, settling back with the slow care of someone whose joints protested sudden movements. But I've been in religious life for 53 years, Detective Reed. I've guided dozens of young women through their formation process. I can usually sense when someone has found their true calling versus when someone is using religious life as an escape mechanism. And Sister Mary Catherine was escaping? I believe so, yes, but from what exactly I was never able to determine. Her expression grew troubled, lines deepening around her eyes. Which brings me to something I should have told you 12 years ago, something I've regretted keeping to myself all this time. I felt that familiar quickening of pulse that comes when an investigation suddenly shifts into new territory. What is it? About 2 weeks before she disappeared, Sister Mary Catherine received a letter. Personal mail was always delivered through my office. It's part of our protocols for novices. And I could see immediately that this letter upset her deeply. Her hands were shaking when she read it, and her face went completely white. This was entirely new information. Nothing like it had appeared in any of the original case files. Did you ask her about the letter? I did, but she said it was just communication from her family, nothing important. But Detective Reed, I'd seen letters from her family before. Occasional notes from her siblings, updates about her mother's treatment programs. This wasn't that kind of correspondence. This letter terrified her. Mother Superior's voice dropped almost to a whisper, as if sharing a confession. For the next 2 weeks, she was a different person. She'd always been quiet, but she became almost silent. She stopped participating in community conversations, spent long hours alone in the chapel, often missing meals. During night prayers, I would see her crying, though she tried to hide it. I wrote furiously, trying to capture every detail. Do you have any idea what happened to this letter? That's what I've been wondering for 12 years. When we searched her room after she disappeared, all her personal belongings were there. Clothes, toiletries, a few books, some family photographs. But I never found that letter. Either she destroyed it or someone else took it, I finished. She nodded gravely. Detective Reed, I need to ask you something directly. Do you think Sister Mary Catherine left voluntarily, or do you think someone took her? I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the evidence we'd gathered over the years, the lack of signs of struggle, the timing of her disappearance. Based on what we knew 12 years ago, voluntary departure seemed most likely. But this new information about the letter changes things significantly. I spent another hour going through the detailed timeline of that March evening, cross-referencing my old notes with Mother Superior's recollections. Evening prayers in the main chapel ended at 8:30 p.m. Sister Mary Catherine was seen by two other nuns walking back toward the dormitory wing at approximately 8:45 p.m. Sister Anne Marie, whose room was adjacent to Sister Mary Catherine's, reported hearing her door close around 9 p.m. The night silence bell rang at 9:30 p.m., after which all nuns were expected to remain in their rooms for prayer and rest. When the morning prayers bell rang at 6 a.m., Sister Mary Catherine didn't appear in the chapel. Sister Anne Marie went to check on her and found her room empty, the bed unslept in, but otherwise undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no indication of hasty packing, no note explaining her absence. The only thing missing was her personal Bible, the same Bible that had now surfaced in a Portland pawnshop 12 years later. As our conversation drew to a close, I gathered my notes and prepared to leave, but Mother Superior walked me toward the door with obvious reluctance, as if she had more to say, but wasn't sure how to express it. "Detective Reed," she said finally, her hand resting on the door handle. "I've prayed for Sister Mary Catherine every single day since she disappeared. In my morning prayers, during evening vespers, in quiet moments throughout each day. If someone hurt her, if she came to harm because I failed to protect her, I need to know. The uncertainty has been difficult to bear." She paused, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that spoke of deep personal anguish. But if she chose to leave, if she decided that religious life wasn't her calling after all, I need to know that too. Not knowing has been like carrying a wound that never heals. I found myself moved by her honesty, by the genuine care she'd maintained for a young woman who'd been in her charge for such a brief time. "Mother Superior, I promise you that I'll follow this investigation wherever it leads. The truth, whatever it is, deserves to come to light." As I drove away from St. Bartholomew's, the setting sun casting long shadows across the convent grounds, I found myself thinking about the gap between the official investigation we'd conducted 12 years ago and the human reality that Mother Superior Agnes had just revealed. The letter, the terror in Sister Mary Catherine's eyes, the 2 weeks of fear that preceded her disappearance. These weren't details that had somehow been overlooked in our original work. They were secrets that had been kept, information that hadn't been shared, pieces of the puzzle that were only now being offered up. The question now was whether this new information would finally provide the key to understanding what had happened to Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly, or whether it would simply deepen the mystery that had already consumed so many years and so many prayers. The security footage from Mrs. Henderson's pawnshop was grainy, but clear enough to make out details. The man who'd brought in Sister Mary Catherine's Bible was tall, lean, with dark hair and a nervous energy that came through even on the black and white recording. He'd given the name David Martinez and a phone number that, predictably, turned out to be fake. I sat in my car outside the pawn shop, studying the printed screenshots while the rain drummed against my windshield. Something about the man's mannerisms seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking his watch. Classic signs of someone who didn't want to be there, but felt compelled to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my partner of 8 years. "Working late again, dinner's getting cold." I typed back a quick apology, promising to be home soon, but we both knew how these cases consumed me. Sarah understood the job, but understanding and accepting weren't always the same thing. The next morning, I drove to the address David Martinez had provided, a rundown apartment complex in southeast Portland. The manager, a weathered man named Chuck who smelled like cigarettes and stale coffee, confirmed what I already suspected. "Nobody by that name lives here," Chuck said, shaking his head. "Hasn't been a Martinez in this building for at least 6 months." I showed him the screenshot from the security footage. Chuck squinted at the image, then shrugged. "Could be anybody, detective. These folks come and go." Back at the station, I ran the photo through our facial recognition database. While I waited for results, I pulled up property records for the area around the pawn shop. Sometimes, people chose locations near places they were familiar with. Old addresses, workplaces, family connections. The facial recognition came back with no matches, but something else caught my attention. The property records showed that a house 3 blocks from the pawn shop had been sold recently. Estate sale after the owner's death. The deceased was listed as Margaret Martinez, aged 78. David Martinez. Margaret Martinez. I felt that familiar tingle of a lead developing. Maybe the grandson story wasn't entirely fabricated. Maybe he really had been cleaning out his grandmother's house, but had lied about his identity for reasons I didn't yet understand. Margaret Martinez's obituary painted the picture of a woman who'd lived quietly, worked as a seamstress for 40 years, never married, no children listed. But obituaries don't always tell the complete story. I made a note to visit the house the next day and talk to the neighbors. In my experience, grandmothers who take in Bibles that belong to missing nuns usually have stories worth hearing. As I locked up my desk that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sister Mary Catherine's disappearance was about to become a lot more complicated than anyone had imagined. Margaret Martinez's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its small front yard overgrown with weeds, and its windows covered with newspapers from the inside. The "Sold" sign in the front yard swayed in the morning breeze, and I could see moving boxes stacked on the front porch through the storm door. Mrs. Chen from next door had been watching me from her kitchen window since I'd parked, so I decided to start there. She answered the door before I finished knocking, her elderly frame wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the mild November weather. "You're a policeman," she said matter-of-factly, studying my badge. About time someone came asking about Margaret. "What can you tell me about her?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. Mrs. Chen's eyes sharpened. "Lived here 37 years, kept to herself mostly. But I saw things, detective. I saw the visitors she had, especially in the last few months." She invited me in for tea, settling into a chair positioned perfectly to observe the Martinez house. Margaret was a good woman, but she carried secrets, heavy ones. You could see it in the way she walked, like she was carrying invisible weight. "What kind of visitors?" I prompted. "Young man started coming around about 6 months ago. Tall, dark-haired, always seemed nervous. They'd talk on the front porch, and I could see Margaret getting upset. Then, about 2 months ago, he started bringing things, boxes, bags. I thought maybe he was helping her clean house, but now I'm wondering." The description matched the man from the pawn shop footage. "Did you ever hear names? Anything they talked about?" Mrs. Chen shook her head, then paused. "Wait. There was one thing. About 3 weeks ago, I heard them arguing. The young man was saying something about keeping promises and doing right by her. Margaret was crying, which I'd never seen before. I finished my tea and walked over to the Martinez house. The front door was locked, but I could see through gaps in the newspaper-covered windows. The house was largely empty, but there were still some items scattered around, the remnants of a life being packed away. As I was walking back to my car, a moving truck pulled up. 2 men got out and started loading boxes from the porch. I approached the driver, showing my badge. "I'm investigating something connected to this house," I told him. "Who hired you to move these items?" The driver checked his clipboard. "David Martinez. Paid cash, said he was the grandson. Seemed like a nice enough guy, but he was real specific about which boxes to take and which ones to leave for donation." My pulse quickened. "Is he coming back?" "Supposed to meet us at the storage unit at 2 o'clock. Place called Secure Space on Division Street." I checked my watch, 12:30. I had just enough time to call for backup and position myself at the storage facility. After 12 years of dead ends and false leads, I finally had a real chance to find answers about Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly's disappearance. As I drove toward Division Street, my mind raced through possibilities. Who was David Martinez really? Why did he have Sister Mary Catherine's Bible? And what secrets had his grandmother been keeping that were worth arguing about? Secure Space Storage sat behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, its rows of orange metal doors stretching back like a geometric maze. I positioned myself across the street in my unmarked car, backup units stationed at both entrances. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the moving truck pulled into the facility. The man I now knew as David Martinez climbed out of a blue Honda Civic that had seen better days. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his surroundings. This wasn't a man conducting routine family business. This was someone afraid of being caught. I watched him direct the movers to Unit 247, halfway down the second row. They unloaded boxes efficiently while Martinez stood guard, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. When the movers finished and drove away, he lingered, staring at the storage unit as if debating whether to run. That's when I made my move. "David Martinez," I called out, approaching slowly with my hands visible. "I'm Detective Reed, Portland Police. I'd like to talk to you about your grandmother's belongings." He spun around, and I got my first clear look at his face. Mid-30s, hollow cheeks, eyes that held the weight of sleepless nights. There was something familiar about his features, but I still couldn't place it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You sold a Bible to Mrs. Henderson's pawn shop yesterday. A Bible that belonged to Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly, who disappeared 12 years ago. I need to know how your grandmother came to have it." David's face went white. For a moment, I thought he might bolt, but instead, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You don't understand. I was trying to do the right thing." "Then, help me understand," I said, keeping my voice calm. "What happened to Sister Mary Catherine?" He looked around the storage facility, then back at me. "Can we talk somewhere private?" "What I have to tell you, it's going to change everything you think you know about that night." 20 minutes later, we sat in an interview room at the station. David had waived his right to a lawyer, insisting he wanted to tell the truth. I started the recording equipment and settled back in my chair. "My real name is David Chen," he began. "The lie about Martinez finally falling away. Margaret Martinez wasn't my grandmother, she was Catherine's grandmother." I felt the pieces start to shift in my mind. Catherine. Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly. Her real name was Catherine Martinez. She changed it when she entered the convent because she was hiding from someone. From me. The room felt suddenly smaller. You knew her before she became a nun? David's hands trembled as he reached for the water cup I'd provided. We were married, Detective Reed. Catherine Martinez was my wife, and the night she disappeared from that convent, she came home to me. The case I thought I understood completely turned upside down in that moment. Sister Mary Catherine hadn't been abducted or murdered. She'd been living a double life, and someone had finally convinced her to choose which one she wanted to keep. The revelation that Sister Mary Catherine had been married changed everything. I stared at David Chen across the interview table, trying to process what he'd just told me, while my recorder captured every word. Start from the beginning, I said. How long were you married before she entered the convent? David rubbed his face with both hands. We got married when we were both 21, right out of college. Catherine was studying social work. I was finishing my degree in education. We were young, broke, but we thought love was enough. He paused, staring at the table. We were wrong. What happened? Catherine's family was deeply religious, but they were also deeply troubled. Her mother's addiction got worse after we married, and Catherine felt responsible. She started spending more and more time at church, talking to the priests about her calling to help people. I supported it at first. I thought it was just volunteer work. I made notes, trying to understand the timeline. When did she first mention becoming a nun? About 6 months into our marriage. She said she felt called to religious life, that maybe she'd made a mistake marrying so young. I was devastated, but I loved her enough to let her explore her faith. David's voice grew quiet. I just never thought she'd actually go through with it. But she did join the convent, under a false name. David nodded. She said she needed a clean break from her past to properly discern her calling. She took her grandmother's maiden name, Donnelly, and created a whole new identity. I agreed to the separation, thinking it would be temporary, that she'd realize she belonged with me. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was more complex than I'd expected. You stayed married this entire time? Legally, yes. Catherine never filed for divorce, and neither did I. I kept hoping she'd come back. For 18 months, I had no contact with her. The convent believed she was single, that she'd never been married. It was all a lie. I leaned forward. So what changed? Why did she leave the convent that night in March 2012? David's eyes filled with tears. Her grandmother, our grandmother Margaret, was dying. Catherine had been Margaret's only family, and Margaret had been keeping our secret all this time. When Margaret got the terminal diagnosis, she begged Catherine to come home. Said she couldn't die knowing Catherine was living a lie. And Catherine chose to leave? She struggled with it for weeks. That letter Mother Superior mentioned. That was from me, begging her to come see Margaret before it was too late. Catherine finally agreed to meet me after evening prayers. She brought her Bible because she said she needed to pray over her decision. The story was becoming clearer, but it raised new questions. Where has she been for 12 years? David's face crumpled. That's the part that's going to be hardest for you to understand, Detective. Catherine came home that night, but she wasn't the same person who'd left. The guilt of deceiving the convent, the pressure of Margaret's illness, the confusion about what she really wanted. It broke something in her mind. I waited, sensing there was more to come. She developed what the doctors called a dissociative disorder. Some days she was Catherine, my wife. Other days she insisted she was Sister Mary Catherine and couldn't understand why she wasn't at the convent. Margaret and I spent the next 12 years taking care of her. trying to get her the help she needed while keeping her existence secret. David's revelation about Catherine's mental condition cast the entire case in a new light. I found myself grappling with questions that had no easy answers about identity, faith, and the lengths people go to protect those they love. "Where is Catherine now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David stared at his hands. "She died 3 months ago, Detective. Complications from pneumonia." Margaret was devastated. She'd spent 12 years caring for Catherine like she was her own daughter. That's when Margaret's health started failing too. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I wasn't dealing with an ongoing missing person situation, but sadness for the young woman whose search for meaning had led to such a complicated and hidden life. "How did you manage to keep her hidden for so long?" "It wasn't easy. Margaret owned her house outright, and she had a basement apartment that she'd never rented out. We converted it into a small living space for Catherine. When she was having good days, she'd help Margaret with cooking and gardening. When she was having bad days..." David's voice trailed off. "What happened on the bad days?" "She'd become agitated, insisting she needed to return to the convent for prayers. Sometimes she'd try to leave, and we'd have to convince her that it was a rest day, or that Mother Superior had given her permission to stay with family. We became experts at managing her delusions while trying to help her remember who she really was. I thought about the man-hours that had been spent searching for Sister Mary Catherine, the grief of the nuns who'd prayed for her return, the resources dedicated to a case that was, in essence, a family medical crisis handled in secret. Why didn't you contact authorities? Get her professional help?" David's eyes flashed with something between anger and desperation. "You think we didn't try? Do you know what happens when someone who's been declared missing for over a decade suddenly reappears with a mental illness? The legal complications alone would have destroyed what little stability Catherine had left." He had a point. The bureaucratic nightmare of Catherine's situation would have been overwhelming for someone in her fragile mental state. "We did get her professional help," David continued. "Margaret used her life savings to pay for private doctors, therapists, medications. Everything under the table, everything to protect Catherine's privacy and dignity. We weren't hiding her from the law, Detective. We were protecting her from a system that wouldn't understand." I made more notes, trying to piece together the timeline. "When did Margaret start getting sick?" "About 6 months ago. She'd been battling diabetes for years, but it was getting worse. That's when she asked me to start coming by more often to help with Catherine's care. Margaret was terrified of what would happen to Catherine if she died first. And then Catherine died." David nodded, wiping his eyes. Suddenly, unexpectedly, Margaret blamed herself, said she should have taken Catherine to the hospital sooner. But Catherine had been so afraid of strangers, of official places. We'd been managing her care at home for so long that going to a hospital seemed like it would cause more trauma than healing. The weight of their situation was becoming clear to me. Two people who'd spent over a decade caring for someone whose very existence couldn't be officially acknowledged, making impossible decisions with no good options. "That brings us to the Bible," I said. Margaret kept it on Catherine's nightstand. She said it was the only thing that consistently comforted Catherine, regardless of which personality was dominant on any given day. After Catherine died, Margaret couldn't bear to look at it anymore. As David continued his story, I found myself understanding the impossible situation that had trapped 3 people in a web of secrets and sacrifice. The Bible, Sister Mary Catherine's most treasured possession, had become both a comfort and a burden for the small family that had protected her. "Margaret made me promise something before she died," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. She made me promise to return Catherine's things to where they belonged. She felt guilty about keeping Catherine's disappearance secret for so long, said the nuns deserved to know what happened to her. I could see the moral weight that had been pressing on David's shoulders. But you didn't take the Bible directly to the convent. I was going to. I drove there twice, sat in the parking lot with the Bible on my passenger seat. But every time I tried to go in, I thought about the questions they'd ask. How could I explain 12 years of caring for someone who was supposed to be missing? How could I make them understand that we weren't criminals? We were just people trying to do right by someone we loved. David's internal struggle was evident in every word. So, I decided to let the police figure it out. I thought if I sold the Bible to a pawn shop, eventually someone would recognize it and start an investigation. That way, the truth could come out without me having to be the one to tell it. I had to admire the logic, even if it had made my job more complicated. What about Catherine's death certificate? Her burial? We had her cremated under her married name, Catherine Chen. I have all the documentation. Margaret wanted to make sure everything was legal and proper, even if we couldn't make it public right away. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I brought copies of everything. The death certificate, medical records, photos of Catherine over the years. I know you'll need proof. I opened the envelope and found myself looking at 12 years of hidden life. Medical records showing treatment for dissociative identity disorder. Photos of a woman who looked like Sister Mary Catherine, but dressed in civilian clothes, sometimes smiling peacefully in a garden, sometimes staring blankly at the camera with confusion in her eyes. One photo particularly struck me. Catherine sitting on a porch swing with an elderly woman who must have been Margaret, both of them reading from the leather-bound Bible. It was a picture of quiet companionship, of two people finding peace in shared faith despite impossible circumstances. These photos, I said, Catherine looks content in some of them. David smiled for the first time since I'd met him. She had good days, especially in the last few years, as she got older. Sometimes she'd remember our wedding, talk about wanting to renew our vows. Other times, she'd talk about missing the other sisters, about wanting to return to serve God. But there were also days when she seemed to find peace with both parts of herself. I studied the documents more carefully. The medical records painted a picture of a woman struggling with profound identity confusion, but who had been receiving consistent, loving care from two people who'd sacrificed their own normal lives to protect her. David, I need to ask you something directly. Did Catherine ever express that she wanted to return to the convent? Did she ever ask you to contact them? He was quiet for a long moment. In her final weeks, when she was lucid, she talked about wanting to make things right. She said she knew the sisters must be worried, must be praying for her. She wanted to write them a letter explaining everything, but she was too weak. That's another reason Margaret made me promise to return her things. As I sat there with the evidence of Catherine's hidden life spread before me, I realized that this case had never really been about a missing person. It had been about identity, about the sometimes impossible choices people make when trying to serve both love and faith, and about the quiet heroism of ordinary people protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. The hardest part of my job isn't solving cases, it's delivering answers that change how people see the world. As I drove back to St. Bartholomew's Convent with David's documentation and Catherine's personal effects, I thought about how to explain 12 years of secrets to people who'd spent 12 years in prayer and hope. Mother Superior Agnes met me in the same parlor where our conversation had started, but this time her face carried a mixture of anticipation and dread. "You found answers," she said simply. "I did," I replied, settling into the familiar chair. "But they're not the answers anyone expected." I told her Catherine's story carefully, watching her face as each revelation transformed her understanding of the young novice she'd known. When I finished, Mother Superior sat in silence for several minutes, her hands folded in prayer position. She was married, she finally said. All this time, she was someone's wife. Yes, and she was also genuinely struggling with her faith, genuinely seeking her calling. Both things were true, simultaneously. Mother Superior rose and walked to the window overlooking the convent gardens. I failed her. I should have seen that she was carrying such a burden. I should have asked more questions about that letter, about why she seemed so troubled. "You gave her a place of peace when she needed it most," I said. David showed me photos of Catherine over the years. Even in her confusion, she carried something from her time here, a sense of spiritual calm that helped her through the worst days. I showed Mother Superior some of the photos David had provided, including the one of Catherine reading her Bible with Margaret. She never stopped being both people. Your sister Mary Catherine and David's wife Catherine. Her illness didn't allow her to choose between them, but the love she received from both communities kept her whole. Mother Superior studied the photos with tears in her eyes. She looks peaceful in some of these. David said she found moments of clarity where she could hold both parts of her identity without conflict. She spoke often about the sisters, about wanting to return to serve God, but she also remembered her marriage vows, her commitment to her husband. We talked for another hour about Catherine's life, about the impossible situation that had trapped everyone involved. When I prepared to leave, Mother Superior walked me to the door with Catherine's Bible in her hands. "Detective Reed, I have a favor to ask. Would you give this back to David?" Catherine chose to take it with her when she left us, and she kept it for 12 years. It belongs with him now. The gesture moved me more than I expected. "Are you sure?" "Faith isn't about the building you pray in or the clothes you wear," she said quietly. "It's about how you love others when love is difficult. David and Margaret showed extraordinary faithful love. Catherine's Bible should stay where that kind of love lives." As I drove away from the convent, I thought about the different ways people serve God and each other. Catherine had sought to serve through religious vows, but ultimately she'd been served by two people who'd given up their normal lives to care for her. There was something profoundly spiritual about that sacrifice, even if it didn't fit conventional religious forms. That evening, I met David at a coffee shop near his apartment. When I handed him the Bible, he held it like it was made of glass and gold. "Mother Superior wanted you to have this," I told him. "She said Catherine chose to take it with her, and that choice should be honored." David opened the Bible to the inscription that had started this entire investigation. "Sister Mary Catherine Donnelly entered into service September 15th, 2010. Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added, Catherine Chen, faithful wife, beloved daughter, 1987 മുതൽ 2024. Margaret wrote that," David said softly. "The day after Catherine died, she said Catherine had served faithfully in all her roles, and they all deserved to be remembered." 3 weeks later, I sat in my office finishing the final report on what had officially become known as the Sister Mary Catherine Resolution, rather than the Sister Mary Catherine investigation. The language mattered. This hadn't been a crime to solve, but a mystery to understand. The case files told only part of the story. The full truth was more complex, more human, and ultimately more redemptive than anyone could have imagined when a young nun disappeared after evening prayers 12 years ago. I'd spent considerable time with David in the weeks following our interview, helping him navigate the legal complexities of Catherine's situation. Her death certificate was amended to include her religious name, acknowledging both identities she'd carried. The church had agreed to hold a memorial service for Sister Mary Catherine, recognizing her as someone who'd served faithfully even outside traditional structures. Margaret Martinez's estate was settled quietly, with provisions made for Catherine's medical records to be donated to researchers studying dissociative disorders. David hoped that Catherine's experience might help other families facing similar impossible situations. But perhaps the most meaningful resolution came from an unexpected source. The other nuns at St. Bartholomew's had asked if they could create a memorial garden for Catherine in the convent grounds. They planted roses and herbs that could be used for healing, and installed a small bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of Sister Mary Catherine, who taught us that love serves in many forms." David visited the garden regularly, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting quietly with Catherine's Bible. Mother Superior told me that he'd begun attending their public prayer services, finding comfort in the community that had sheltered Catherine during her most searching years. The case officially closed on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after Mrs. Henderson had called about a Bible in her pawn shop. I'd learned long ago that detective work rarely provides the neat resolutions that people expect from crime dramas. Real life is messier, more ambiguous, and often more beautiful than fiction allows. As I locked the file away, I thought about the lesson Catherine's story had taught me. Sometimes the people we're searching for aren't really missing. They're just living lives too complicated for simple explanations. Sometimes love means protecting someone's privacy rather than exposing their truth. And sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't about who committed a crime, but about how people choose to care for each other when conventional solutions don't exist. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dinner's ready when you are. No case files at the table tonight." I smiled, powered down my computer, and headed home to my own version of faithful love, the kind that accepts a detective's irregular hours and complicated cases, and that creates space for ordinary grace in the middle of extraordinary mysteries. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation. David Chen was marrying again, a social worker named Elena who specialized in supporting families dealing with mental illness. The invitation included a handwritten note. "Catherine would have wanted me to find love again. Thank you for helping me understand that healing sometimes means letting go while holding on to what matters most." I attended the wedding, held in the same church where David and Catherine had been married 13 years earlier. During the ceremony, I noticed that David carried Catherine's Bible, and that Mother Superior Agnes was among the guests, representing the community that had loved Catherine in her searching years. As I watched David and Elena exchange vows, I realized that Catherine's story wasn't really about disappearance and discovery. It was about the many ways people choose to honor their commitments to love, even when those commitments become more complicated than anyone could have foreseen. Some mysteries, I've learned, resolve not with answers, but with acceptance. And sometimes that's exactly the resolution everyone needed. Enad.